welcome to the first week of Easy Like a Sunday Story. It's exciting, isn't it? Something new. Not much new stuff going on at the moment, not in a positive way, anyway. Anyway, I wanted to welcome you to have a cup of tea with me or something stronger. No judgment here, whatever you're choosing to do. And welcome you to the first story. I'm hoping that they bring some light entertainment. It's been a tough week, I think, and so I'm really pleased to be. For me, the message of this week is creativity. That's the thing that's keeping me sane at the moment. So I really appreciate you joining me and engaging with the stuff that I'm putting out. And if it makes you giggle, if it makes you smile, if you literally have no reaction to it at all, that's fine. But it's helping me, and it's really nice to feel, kind of in connected a little bit with the community still. So today's story is called The Mystery of Margaret MERRILL, and I don't want to give too much away. You'll probably like it if you're into a bit of gardening. Nice to think of the forthcoming spring, perhaps, or the memories of last summer. We all got a little bit into gardening, didn't we? And that's when I wrote this story. So there's a little bit of history about some flowers and things, and how gardens can make or break relationships. So enjoy. It could be said, and often was, that Chelsea Street was the prettiest road in St Albans, and the prettiest part of the prettiest street were the gardens at number 27 and 29. Much like you would find the road with the best lights at Christmas time to take the family for a drive-by, people would make special trips to Chelsea Street to view the marvel of the glorious patch of botanical bliss, a bit like a flora safari. The gardens belonged to neighbours of 50 years, Mrs Thorne and Mr Morgan. Their gardens hadn't always looked this way, of course. There'd been children and pets and busy lives out at work, but as they settled into their golden age of life, what had started as a bit of an interest had become their prides and joy. Plus, over the years, they'd seen their town change, become harder with more and more buildings and concrete, worsened when it became a commuter town as London spilled over its edges. More straight lines and hard surfaces, less curves and colours and softness. Their little row of heaven was an oasis amidst the bitumen desert. We can't be sure who sowed the first seed or who encouraged who, but as they shared their cuttings and their compost, their tips and their snippets of wisdom that they'd read about in the Green Fingers fortnightly, quite the beautiful friendship had blossomed. The organic rivalry also helped, and they teased each other with it often. They mostly stuck to the traditional flowers, and they often talked about the meanings or the origins of them. There were early blooms of violets and their powdery scents, known for modesty as they flower so fleetingly. Lilies, one of the oldest flowers in the world, known for purity, born from the tears of Eve as she left the Garden of Eden. Irises, which is said to symbolise the messenger who formed an arc, winging a message across the sky, which we saw as a rainbow. The different varieties they grew had as many colours. Borders of pansies for thoughts. In Victorian times, these were sent to loved ones to remember them by, and so both Mr Morgan and Mrs Thorne planted these for their spouses they had lost. Catching their happy little faces always sparked a memory and cheered them up. A nickname of the pansy was 2 faces under the sun, and this particularly made Mrs Thorne giggle. She remembered how her late husband George would stand at the gate chatting to neighbours, smiling away, and then come in and moan about them for putting their bins out too early or making a noise into the evening. But the pièce de résistance were their roses, the flower of love, the queen of the garden. She was created by Chloris, the Greek goddess of flowers, with the help of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who gave the rose her beauty. Dionysus, god of wine, gave the rose nectar for her sweet scent, and the 3 graces gave her charm, brightness and joy. The roses of 27 and 29 Chelsea Street brought all of those things in abundance to everyone who passed to admire them, and especially to Mrs Thorne and Mr Morgan. They would tend to their gardens every morning, come rain or shine. Mr Morgan in his smart slippers, aged tailored trousers and a thin shirt unbuttoned at the top to his vest with his sleeves rolled up. It was his version of smart casual. He might be in his later years, but you would never get him in a jogging bottom or a t-shirt. He couldn't have a nice garden tended by a scruff bag. Mrs. Thorne had an equally high standard of work attire. She'd often wear a long pleated skirt and match with a flowery top and pumps. That she somehow managed to keep immaculate. Each day she accessorised with a different headscarf to keep her brilliant blondie white hair nice and neat. The scarf was always a fresh spring colour. The yellow one was her favourite. Mr. Morgan would always comment on it, saying she looked like a summer's day. They had their daily jobs. Mr. Morgan liked to take cuttings and give them to the children in the neighbourhood. He'd leave them on the path with a note for them to help themselves, but it was a treat when the parents knocked because the kiddies wanted lessons in how to take them. He loved encouraging the younger generation to grow things. Mrs. Thorne was always cleaning the pots and replacing the gravel back into the path piece by piece. She also loved watching and listening to the bees on the vast lavender beds awash with its light purple colour and its relaxing, calming scent. After the rose, it was Mrs. Thorne's next favourite flower. It was funny. The lavender represented distrust, but the bees didn't seem to have a problem with it. Despite all the other odd jobs, most of the day was always spent on the roses. They could always find something to prune or clip, train or feed. They'd stop at 11:30 for a break, and Mrs. Thorne would make tea. Mr. Morgan had fashioned a level platform on a section of the fence that had a tea tray sat securely on, so there was no risk of unsteady china. This meant Mrs. Thorne could use her almost best crockery. Best was, of course, only for inside. She wasn't a complete lunatic. Plus, the second best had bigger cup loops, and Mr. Morgan had incredibly large hands. They'd stand and chat. They talked about the gardens, but they talked about lots of other things too. The past, the weather, the town, the road. But they'd also talk about their daily lives, who they'd become, whether they were lonely or content, or both. Mr. Morgan never drank a whole cup, partly due to a habit from the tea leaf days, but mainly because he liked to pour what was left on his favourite rose. She was called Margaret MERRILL, a fantastic floribunda rose he planted her for his dear wife for her 60th birthday. She was vibrant, delicate and captivating. You couldn't take your eyes off her, and much like his dear Margaret, when she walked into a room, she always stole the show. Margaret loved her cups of tea, and silly as it sounded, when he shared his with the rose, it felt like she was joining them. If he ever thought about maybe asking Mrs. Thorne for dinner one evening or to take a walk together, he'd pour Margaret Merrill her tea and just didn't feel like he could. Worryingly, the Margaret Merrill hadn't been doing too well recently. It was strange. She'd survived frosts and gales and hosepipe bans and always stood strong, but now he could see her growing more weary and withered each day. Maybe she was telling him it was time to move on. The pair discussed the rose at length, trying to work out what could be going wrong. Mr. Morgan never shared his silly thoughts about his late wife, of course, or ideas about the dinner or the walks. Their routine went on, of work and chats and tea, and the numbers of admirers grew with the warmer weather and the flourishing blooms, as word of their natural spectacle travelled. While both had the quiet desire to outshine the other and collect the most lavish compliments, they were graceful with it and channeled their rivalry into motivation to strive for perfection. It was late summer, and the pair had progressed onto first-name terms. Please. After all these years and the modern days we're living in, I think it's time that you called me Ivy. Well, I would be honoured, but only if you called me John. Oh, I had you down as an Eric. They chuckled. Well, John, it is supposed to storm tomorrow. Aye, it is. I saw that on the telly box. I know we say we'll garden in all weathers, but me old bones might thank me for giving the storm a miss. We could do with a rain, but I shall miss your lovely tea tomorrow. And your company, he thought, but he didn't dare to say. You could come in and have your tea, if you wanted to. There, she'd said it. She'd imagined saying it so many times before, and now she had. Life was getting too short, and she couldn't wait for John any longer to move their friendship out of just the garden. John looked at the struggling Margaret MERRILL. Remnants of her white open flowers with their blush pink sheen hung their heads with fatigue. She was tired and sick. She still smelled as sweet as the day he got her, but her fragrance was fading, and it wouldn't be long in this world. He couldn't bear to cling onto her any longer the way he had in hope with his Margaret, only to be devastated once again. "I'd love to, Mrs. Thorne. Sorry, Ivy," he said with a blush. The next day came, and it certainly did bring with it a storm. John was dressing in his smarter tailored trousers and shirt, and it was so dark from the grey sky he'd had to put a light on. The temperature had dropped a little too, calling for the addition of a rather fetching tank top. He felt nervous, which was silly. It was just tea like every other day, but it was inside Ivy's home. Instead of the tea being a background distraction from the job in hand, the gardening, today it was the main event. Next door, Ivy was experiencing similar feelings. Luckily, getting dressed for the occasion was a distraction. She loved to make an effort, and there had been little cause for it lately. She'd been up cleaning since 6:30, and putting on her favourite outfit, a knee-length tea dress covered in peonies, was her reward. She'd put rollers in to give her dazzling hair a hint of a wave, and toyed with a finger curl, wondering whether it would be too much. She opted to leave it this time, but perhaps if they shared dinner at some point, she would try it then. She smiled at her own presumptuousness and let out a little giggle at her cheek. Her small lounge was gleaming, and everything was in its place. She'd set out the best china, but had left out a mismatched larger cup for John's big fingers so he didn't feel uncomfortable or clumsy. 11:30, precise as ever. He knocked on the door. She let him in before the heavens opened. She thought how dashing he looked. She saw him every day, but he somehow looked different. Smarter, yes, but it was more than that. Maybe the darker light, or not having a fence in between them. The fresh air and sunshine gave him a healthy colour, and it brought out his kind blue eyes. She had not noticed them like that before. "You look fresh as a daisy," he remarked. A floral joke to break the ice. And it worked. They giggled and relaxed. They finished the first pot in a flash and were well into the second before they realised the time. It was way past lunch, and they'd lost themselves sharing stories and photos, laughing and passing the hours. John hadn't wanted to outstay his welcome, but Ivy insisted on making them something to eat and said he simply could not leave in this weather. They knew he could make it to his front door without catching pneumonia or getting blown away, but the excuse suited them both. He politely asked if he could go and wash up before lunch. His hands, not the tea things, and she pointed him to the bathroom. John looked at himself in the mirror. He was smiling, really smiling, and he felt like he hadn't for years. Things were going really well, and he needn't have worried so much. Ivy's hospitality was so welcoming, her house was so warm and cheery. It certainly had the woman's touch, and she looked absolutely beautiful. He could tell she'd made a big effort for him. He was looking for soap. Surely she'd have some. Why did women have so many lotions and potions? There were two, what looked like apothecary bottles on the side of the basin that said Penhaligon. One of those had to be soap, didn't it? He gave a squirt with his almighty hands of, sadly, the hand lotion, which urgently made its way down almost the entirety of the right leg of his trousers. He tried wiping it away with the incredibly soft and quilted loo roll, but it was no good. He tried wetting the loo roll. Despite its premium quality and strength, it just broke apart into clumpy wet pellets. He could hear Margaret in his mind telling him, "Use a damp cloth quick before it stains." And while he knew it was impolite to raid a lady's cupboards, he was sure Ivy wouldn't mind. He simply couldn't go back down there in this mess. He did a quick scout of the area. There was nothing in the mirrored cabinet on the wall and nothing on the windowsill or round the bath, so he opened the cupboard under the basin. Sprays, cotton walls, tablets, what seemed like a million bottles of shampoo, and... Wait, what was this? Hidden right at the back was a large container of glyphosate herbicide. This chemical compound was usually used by farmers to kill weeds and grasses harmful to their crops. John knew that Ivy didn't have any grasses or crops, and neither of them used chemical killers on their gardens. They often talked about it. So why did she have it? John's heart sank. The other thing that glyphosate was harmful to was Rose's. His Margaret MERRILL. She'd been slowly destroying her on purpose. He felt so guilty. He should have known. This way, sir, your table awaits. I know it's a little early, but I thought that we might be cheeky and indulge in a drop of sherry. She stopped as she saw the look on his face and the large green bottle in his hand. Ah. Why, Ivy? Why would you do such a thing? Was it the competition? Jealousy? Not wanting to be overlooked? Yes, all of those things, she replied. I was jealous of Margaret, John. How could I ever compete with her? It wasn't the garden that was being overlooked. It was me. I saw it on the tip of your tongue on more than one occasion, and I willed you to ask me to say something. And every time you threw your tea into the rose, I saw it stop you. Things were never going to change while her perfect memory lived on in that bush. So I started spiking the tea. You commented on the first day that it tasted different, but you didn't notice after that. It didn't seem to harm you, so I carried on. But we talked about the problem. You tried to help me save her. You lied to me. What can I say, John? I'm like the pansy. 2 faces under the sun. With all the distrust of the lavender. And you all the purity of the lily. Poisoned by the ivy. The rain had stopped, but he could still smell the freshness in the air. It smelt of growth and promise. He couldn't believe what had just happened. It was almost poetic in a way, symbolic. Their romance had certainly blossomed fleetingly like the violets. As he looked up, there was a perfectly formed and long-reaching rainbow as bold as he'd ever seen. The arc of the messenger. Well, it had finally been received loud and clear. As he turned into his own path, he bent down, cut the one remaining bloom, and breathed in the comforting notes of the Margaret MERRILL. It seemed a little stronger than before, but the rain often brought out the smell of the roses. I'm sorry, he whispered. I am a silly old fool. As he slowly stood, he noticed something different. A tiny green shoot. A sign of life, and that all was not lost. He closed his eyes and he said, Thank you. He knew she'd come back. She was his showstopper, his head turner. She was certainly not a wallflower. The end. Thank you for listening. That was a bit different, not the kind of stuff that I normally share, but I really enjoyed reading it for you, and I hope that you liked it and that it passed some time and that you enjoyed it. So if you would like to kind of tune in or get notifications, then please click subscribe. And this is a brand new channel and I'm just learning how to put films together. So certainly encouragement for that is to have an audience. So if you please do like what you're experiencing here, then please share and subscribe and kind of help me to spread the word. That would be great. Thank you, and see you next week. Bye bye.